had discussions along these lines before, so I'd have to check on whether there is any applicability to anything we would have oversight of from this White House currently.
And then one economic question, there was Labor Department data this morning that showed a record number of job openings, 10.9 million job openings. But we also still have millions of people who are unemployed and been sitting on the sidelines for a very long time. Just curious if there's any new approach that the administration is going to take to helping employers get their jobs filled. It's curtailing economic growth. So.
Well, I think you're talking about the JOLTS data, yes, which pertains to July data. So it is a little bit old at this point in time, given we're into September, and we've seen jobs numbers come out in that period of time where we've seen that still an average of 700,000 jobs per month are being created, or people are being matched with jobs in that period of time. Look, I think what we look at is the data across the period of time, across a broad period of time. We know our employers are continuing to look for workers to hire, and worker power is rising as workers have more choices available to them, and that continues to be the case. And we believe that having workers empowered is a good sign. We are also seeing that we've created now to date 4 million new jobs, more jobs than any other administration in this period of time in American history. That's also a good sign. So I would say that as we look at our efforts here, we look at whether employers, or we recommend, of course, whether employers are offering a livable wage, whether they're offering benefits to attract workers, and we're also seeing continued positive signs in month-over-month trends as it relates to the economy and job creation. Go ahead.
Does there make sense, when you look at the uptick in vaccinations, mandates and requirements, I think are broadly popular when you look at polling around the country right now, given the scale of the Delta surge that's continued over months, that perhaps you should have been more aggressive earlier when it came to pursuing policies like that?
Well, we have seen, yes, they're not only popular, but they are also effective. We've also known as, say, the federal government as one of the biggest employers in the country that we knew we would take an approach over time to implement any mandates or mandates that would require vaccination by employees. There are some companies out there that were waiting for final approval by the FDA. There also were some companies that wanted a period of time to implement mandates. That's all understandable. So our view is this is certainly one of the ways that we've seen more people get vaccinated. We've seen it be effective, and we've seen it rise in approval and support across the country as people who are vaccinated are increasingly popular. But all we can do at this point is look forward and determine how we can take steps now to continue to get more people vaccinated and get the pandemic under control.
And then one on the flights that have been stuck in Afghanistan. I understand the state is leading on this, but you guys have made clear you're paying very close attention to American citizens still in the country. I'm trying to square where things actually stand. The Secretary of State said a couple of times it was a documentation issue. A U.S. Senator, Richard Blumenthal, pushed back vociferously on that. Today, the Secretary of State said the Taliban are not permitting the charter flights to leave, and putting it precisely on them. What's your understanding of the holdup? And if the Taliban is preventing them, what levers do you have right now?
Well, there a couple pieces are true here. So one is we are continuing to press the Taliban, the Secretary of State is, to do more to abide by allowing American citizens, individuals with who are legal permanent residents, and individuals with proper documentation to depart the country. It is also true that we don't have a role in preventing flights from taking off. We are not on the ground. So that is not something the U.S. government is doing. But at the same time, some of these planes and some of the issues is where are they going to land? So a number of these planes, they may have a handful of American citizens, but they may have several hundred individuals where we don't have manifests for them. We don't know what the security protocols are for them. We don't know what their documentation is. And there is a fundamental question, and this is one of the hard choices you face in government. Are we going to allow a plane with hundreds of people where we don't know who they are, we don't know what security protocols have been put in place to land on a U.S. military base? And there are reasonable questions, justified questions, I think, as to why we wouldn't do that. And so right now there are some charter planes that are taking off. We do have to make evaluations about the safety and security and protocols in place as planes are landing on military bases. And there are some challenges as it relates to documentation, where a number of people may not have documentation, some for good reason, because they're trying to depart Afghanistan. But that is something we're working through. These handful of American citizens, we are also in touch with. They are not the majority of these flights. Far from it. It is a small number of American citizens who we're talking about on these charter flights.
Can I follow up on that, please, Jen? So
Sure.
Are you essentially saying that, is the administration essentially saying, I'm picking up from what Secretary Blinken has said today about documentation, is the administration essentially saying that Taliban is the only one who has access and who's able to check passenger documentation against these flight manifests? And if so, what is stopping the U.S., for example, from sending personnel over there to do this job and to allow these passengers to leave on the flights? I understand they're not all Americans, but many of them are Afghan allies.
Well, none of that is what I said or what the Secretary of State said. So let me try again. So there are the flights. We obviously don't have personnel on the ground. That's correct. We don't. What our objective is, and we have a presence in Qatar, right, as you know, our Secretary of State has been on the ground in Qatar, is negotiating and having discussions as we speak with international partners, and also members of our State Department are in discussions with the Taliban, because we do want to work through and ensure that we can allow additional flights to land at military bases. But it is also true that we are not going to allow flights to land where we don't know what security protocols have been taken, whether people have been vetted, who are on these planes. And I don't think the vast majority of American citizens want us to do that either. So right now, we are working through this process, and we are also in touch with the American citizens who are on these flights or who are in the vicinity, which are a very small number, to work through getting them out of Afghanistan. We are committed to that. We absolutely want to do that. We've already evacuated a handful of people, and we're continuing to work through. Now, things that will make it much easier for certain are if Qatari Airlines, we're working with them to see if they can get flights up and operational, more efforts to get individuals evacuated over land. We're working through all of these components, and it's the reason why the Secretary of State is on the ground in the region discussing and negotiating as we speak. Okay, we're going to keep going, Vija. Go ahead, Vija.
Do this,
Go ahead,
Jen.
Vija. I think I answered your question. Go ahead, Vija.
Thanks, Jen. I wanted to follow up on the President's speech tomorrow.
Sure.
You mentioned schools and private sectors as two areas of focus, but you've also been very, firm in maintaining independence between the federal government and what schools and the private sector does. So tomorrow, should we just anticipate the President to say much of what he's already said, to urge those entities to take action, or will there be something new that's actionable?
There will be new steps the President announces tomorrow, absolutely.
And will any of those new steps influence the average American's day-to-day life? Should we expect any new mitigation recommendations, as an example?
It depends on if you're vaccinated or not. Go ahead.
It's possible that there's something new.
There are six steps the President's announcing. There will be new components, as I noted and you noted. Some of that will be related to access to testing. Some will be related to mandates. Some will be related to how we ensure kids are protected in schools. And we'll have more. We'll preview more tomorrow as all the pieces are finalized. But there will be new components that sure will, of course, impact people across the country. But we're also all working together to get the virus under control, to return to our normal lives. And I know many people, I'm sure, are looking forward to hearing what the President has to say.
And then just one quick follow-up on timing. We're just a few days away from September 11th. Do you have any update on when the DOJ might release those FBI documents related to the investigation?
I don't. It's their process. They're obviously overseeing. I think we said a couple of weeks ago we didn't anticipate that process would necessarily be done in advance of September 11th. It's really based on their timing. It's not a deadline. I don't think that they've set for that.
Thank you, Jen. Following up on these charter flights that the Taliban is holding up in Afghanistan, the Secretary of State said there are limits to what we can do without personnel on the ground.
Yeah.
You just said we are not on the ground.
You're right.
Whose fault is that?
I don't think this is about fault here. I'm conveying, I think what people want to understand is what we're doing to help address it. There's a handful of Americans, and I'm sure you're not suggesting we should have flights with hundreds of people we don't know who they are, where there's no security protocols.
Too few to go in.
Too few, I just am conveying to you, there's a handful of Americans who we are also in touch with, and we are working to help get evacuated from Afghanistan. But decisions you have to make in the federal government are not yes and no decisions or as simple as what you're laying out here. What we're evaluating and looking at is how to keep people on our military bases safe while also getting these U.S. citizens, dual citizens, people who are prepared to leave Afghanistan, able to leave. At the same time, we don't think we're not going to allow flights that have hundreds of people who we don't know who they are, who haven't been security protocols, where we haven't seen the manifests, to land on U.S. military bases.
Okay, there are now more terrorists wanted by the FBI and the new Afghan government than there are women. Does the president think that is a foreign policy success?
Well, first of all, no one in this administration, not the president nor anyone on the national security team, would suggest that the Taliban are respected and valued members of the global community. They have not earned that in any way, and we have never assessed that. This is a caretaker cabinet that does include 4 former imprisoned Taliban fighters. We have not validated that. We have not conveyed we're going to recognize it. What we are working to do, and nor are we rushing to recognition, there's a lot they have to do before that. What we are working to do is to engage with them because they oversee and control Afghanistan right now to get American citizens, legal permanent residents, SIV applicants out of Afghanistan. We have to engage with them.
To engage with them, their new acting interior minister is a Haqqani network terrorist. He's wanted for a bombing that killed 6 people, including an American. He's believed to have participated in cross-border attacks against U.S. troops. There's a $10 million bounty on his head. Why are we engaging?
Should we not talk to the people who are overseeing Afghanistan and just leave it and not get the rest of the American citizens out?
What are you waiting for them to do? They just formed their government. What are you waiting for? Something?
Waiting for what?
You're saying that we're not going to rush to recognition. That means that there could be recognition.
As we've said many times, the international community is watching. The United States is watching. It's whether they let people depart the country who want to depart, whether they treat women across the country as they have committed to treat them, and how they behave and operate. And therefore, we're not moving toward recognition. At the same time, we're dealing with a reality world here where we have to engage in order to get American citizens and others out of the country.
Hey, I'm Rob Finnerty. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please join the conversation in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe, too. Hit the bell icon to be alerted to breaking news. And remember, there's a whole lot more on Newsmax TV, America's fastest growing cable news network. Newsmax TV, we're real news for real people.